I think early on we knew our family was going to be heavily involved in missions. We both just felt this was the way we wanted to try to live our lives, in the center of God's will, and we wanted our children to always know that we were a family on mission for God. We basically put our yes on the table and agreed that no matter what, the safest place to be was in the center of God's will. We decided to start looking for opportunities that God was creating for us to go out onto the mission field. Finally, our first opportunity came. I was invited to go with a mission team to Egypt to minister to young Coptic Christians living in Cairo. We decided that David would stay home with our daughters on this trip since they were still so young. The experience was absolutely life-changing, and I was so excited for David to have an experience like that.
It wasn't long before we had an opportunity for both of us to go on a mission trip to Egypt, but this time together. And this experience was absolutely amazing, and it only reinforced our passion to be involved in global missions. We loved Egypt and ministering to the people there. Actually, over the next few years, between the two of us, we had traveled to Egypt 6 times. However, in 2011, we sensed that this chapter of our ministry was coming to a close, and that God had something else waiting for us.
We had some friends living on the mission field in South America, in Lima, Peru. We decided to go visit them and see if maybe the Lord was calling us there. Our entire family went, and we loved experiencing a new culture. However, we did not feel a strong sense that God was calling us there long term. Finally, in 2013, a mission organization asked David to travel to Meru, Kenya to shoot video of their ministry work for their supporters back home. I told David to consider that maybe now is the time to start letting our daughters experience the mission field. I asked him if he would be willing to take our oldest daughter, Karis, with him. She was only 9 years old, but it felt like the right time.
So in July 2013, we headed off to sub-Saharan Africa, to a country and a community that would forever be a part of our lives. I really couldn't believe how comfortable we both felt there. I remember asking Karis what she thought of Kenya, and she told me that she really loved it. I asked her if she could even imagine possibly living there, and she said absolutely. We really had the most amazing experience. Karis quickly made friends and was completely embraced by the younger kids that we met there. The ministry that we were visiting had a part-time employee named Paul Karema, who I quickly became friends with. I met Paul on my very first day in Meru, and little did I know at the time he would be playing a major part in the ministry that God was calling Sarah and I to start. In fact, during that trip, unknowingly, I briefly crossed paths with a number of people who would eventually be a part of the ministry we now have. The journey home proved to be the most difficult challenge, and I think the enemy was going to do everything he could to destroy the memory of this amazing experience we had. But once I got home, it didn't take long for the good memories to overshadow the bad ones. I couldn't get over what I had experienced in Kenya. It was amazing, and I knew I needed to get over my fears and frustrations and see if Sarah would possibly be willing to travel back to Kenya with me next year.
I really didn't know what to think, but I was willing to give it a try. I know that David and Karis had a meaningful experience, so maybe God was guiding us in that direction. In July 2014, David and I traveled to Kenya together, where God revealed the plan He had been preparing for us. We traveled with the same mission organization that David and Karis went with the year before. We participated in all the things they were involved in. God gave us eyes to see some things that might become part of a ministry we would start. We participated in a women's ministry that did conferences. That's when we got to work alongside and get to know a woman named Eva Mwenda, who is a pastor to women.
We also visited an orphanage where there were wooden bed frames but no mattresses on some of the beds. Some of the children actually slept on the concrete floor. I think we were shocked at the struggles of both these orphans, but also the women that we had met. I had been going through a one-year Bible at the time, and now every time I saw the phrase widows and orphans, it kind of jumped off the page at me. But none of those passages jumped out at me as much as the first chapter of James, verse 27, where it said, "Pure and genuine religion in the sight of God the Father means caring for orphans and widows in their distress and refusing to let the world corrupt you." Each night, Sarah and I would go back to our room and talk about the experiences that day and what God was saying to us. We thought, what if we could do conferences like that, but do it for widows? So we asked Eva, what's the story with widows in Kenya? And we were shocked to hear how oppressed and persecuted they were. We just didn't expect to hear that. At that point, we both felt there was a clear vision of how we could care for both widows and orphans. And we couldn't stop talking about how crystal clear God had made it to both of us of what He had been preparing us for. We knew without a doubt before we left Kenya that we would be starting our own ministry and what we would be doing and where we would do it. As soon as Sarah and I got home from Kenya, we put together a board of directors from friends that we really trusted, and we contacted a lawyer to begin the process of registering as a 501c3 nonprofit organization. It was about this time in September of 2014 that Paul had told me things with his job were not going great, and he wanted to be a part of this ministry that Sarah and I were starting. It seemed obvious that God was moving everything into place, but we still agreed we should just take a week and pray about this one. After a week of praying about Paul leaving his other job and coming to work for Centerwill, we actually all believed God was at the center of this. And Sarah and I just started paying him out of our personal bank account since Centerwill wasn't registered and we didn't have any funding yet. His first task was to find more of these small orphanages that didn't have any funding and needed things like bedding and clothing and mosquito nets. We also asked him to find 10 children in desperate need of sponsors to help them pay for their school fees and food, children that were orphaned and maybe living with a grandparent. So a big part of the original vision was to help orphans in serious need through a sponsorship program. There was no limit to how many children we were willing to bring into this program, assuming that we had the sponsors. Paul had located 2 perfect small orphanages that needed help, and so it was then that we began our first fundraising project back in October of 2014. The goal was to raise $3,500 for mattresses, bedding, and mosquito nets for these 2 small orphanages. So I blasted our fundraising project on Facebook in hoping my friends would step up and help us pull this one off. We also started looking for sponsors for the first 10 children that Paul had selected. We quickly had all 10 children sponsored, and we actually raised $1,500 more than we needed for the orphanages. So just a few weeks later, now in January of 2015, I traveled to Kenya by myself to carry out this bedding project with Paul by my side. It was absolutely amazing, to go purchase all of these mattresses and the bedding right there in Kenya and deliver them. Our first orphanage was a boys' home, and many of the boys even helped us unload the mattresses. We were also able to help that orphanage with a few other issues they were having. But before I was allowed to deliver the bedding to the second orphanage, the woman in charge requested that we meet. She wanted to know what our intentions were and what kind of people we were. She was an older Kenyan woman named Ann Mugwe, and she had started this children's home about 10 years earlier with some friends. However, all of those friends eventually abandoned the project, and she was left running it by herself with no money. The two of us met and we had a great conversation. She had shared with me how God had revealed to her that He was bringing someone to help long term. That seemed like too big of a commitment for me to consider at that time since I lived in America. I wished her well in finding the person and told her I'd be praying for that. Her orphanage was called Thelian Children's Home. And when I first arrived, I wasn't prepared for what I would see. It was actually shocking. It was a dilapidated home in the slums, and many of the children were much younger than the other orphanage. Anne had been rescuing these little children that were abandoned and living on the streets. We delivered the bedding and a few of the other things that had been requested, but Anne asked if we could just leave it all outside for a period of time, just so that they could first give thanks to God. There's so much more to this story, and it would take hours for me to explain everything, but we knew this wouldn't be our last time to visit the Thelian Children's Home. A couple of other significant things happened during this trip. First, I met with Eva, the women's pastor we had worked with on the previous 2 trips. She wanted to join Centerwill and do women's ministry, but I told her we were really focused on orphans and widows, and that if she was willing to focus her ministry on widows only, we would hire her immediately. At first, she wasn't really sure what to think about reducing her ministry to only widows, but she decided to take a couple of days to think and pray about it with her husband. It was as though God had given her a really clear vision during that time, because she came back to us fully on board, ready to carry out the mission of caring for orphans and widows. The other big thing was that we had hired a young woman named Catherine to manage the child sponsorship program. There was only 10 kids at this point, so it was just a part-time job. Catherine worked at the property where we always stayed at when we visited Kenya, and her job was feeding the animals there. She shared with me one day that it was her dream to work with kids, and we really needed someone to help with the child sponsorship program, so we hired her. There was just something about her that felt like she was supposed to be part of this family. So now we had 3 employees and we were off and running. I headed home to America and started planning our first mission trip for others to participate with. So now it was July 5th of 2015, and we were headed back to Kenya with our first official Centerwill mission team. And finally, the youngest member of my family got to visit Kenya. Allison was now 9 years old, and it was her turn. During this trip, we hosted 3 renewal conferences for widows and our first fun day for orphans, which is basically a one-day VBS. We only had 10 children at the time, and they were all part of this child sponsorship program we created. We also continued our bedding program with a new orphanage with 50 children living in it. We went into town and bought all the beds and the supplies, loaded it all up, and headed to the orphanage. This was such a great experience for our team, and Centerwill had really hit its groove. We were focused on these individual projects that we could fundraise for one at a time. Eva continued ministering to the widows full-time, and we also started to focus our attention on the economic development for these widows. Before we returned home, we decided to stop by the Thelian Children's Home to see how things were going with Anne and the children. We had such a great time, and Anne reminded me that God had told her He was bringing someone to help partner with her in caring for the kids. But this time she told me she was convinced it was Centerwill that God was sending. Now, the idea of that really stressed me out, and I continued to resist because I knew that financially we may not be able to honor that kind of promise. Members of our board of directors started to encourage me to consider that maybe Anne was right and that God really was calling us to partner with her. Sarah and I prayed a lot about this, and at some point we both just had a real sense of peace that this is what we were going to do. I scheduled one more trip to Kenya that year in November of 2015. to visit with Anne and also get some video footage of all the work that Eva was doing with our widows. During this trip, we offered Catherine a full-time position working as our children's director. On my first day back into Kenya, before I'd even made it into town, Anne had contacted Paul and told him she needed to speak with us immediately. This was an emergency, before I went anywhere else. So Paul, Eva, Catherine, and I all met with Anne, where she told us that she had just been diagnosed with cancer and that she would need to undergo chemo and radiation treatment immediately. Anne cried, we cried, and it seemed as though she felt the weight of the world on her back. We kept trying to encourage her, but the only thing she wanted to hear me say is that we would take over the children's home if anything happened to her. Finally, I looked into her eyes and I told her that we absolutely will take care of those children if anything happens to her. She just needed to hear that those children she had rescued and she had loved so much would be taken care of. I spent one more day with her on that trip, and during that time, she let me get one last interview on video.
Also, I started a children's home, not that I had anything. I trusted in God for anything. I trusted that He would send me people to help me, well-wishers. And in fact, when I saw you, straight away I came to know that God is doing something in my life because I'm growing old. God is doing something when He brings you people who can think about the poor in our country, who can think of helping, because not many people here who do that. So I'm so happy and pray that may our good Lord continue blessing you with things, open your doors so that you can also have something to bring to these needy children.
4 weeks later, I got a text message from the oldest boy living there saying that Anne had just passed away. That was the moment our lives forever changed. The first thing I did was contact Paul and ask him to grab Eva and Catherine and head over to that orphanage and make sure that the kids didn't go back out onto the streets. We had to reassure them that we were going to take care of them, just like we promised Anne. We had to figure out who owned the property they were living on and where they went to school. We finally found the landlord and asked him if we could take over the lease and keep the children there. The rent was only $115 a month. He had agreed to let us stay, but only for 1 year, then we needed to move out. Paul looked long and hard to find land that we could purchase, and I did everything I could think of to raise money for this land. It was extremely difficult to find land that we could purchase, and we were running out of time. Finally, we asked the landlord if he could just give us 1 more year. He actually agreed under the condition that our rent went up to $135 a month and that we would absolutely be gone by the end of 2017. We had envisioned a property with no less than 7 acres that we would build small homes on, and there would be 12 children and a house mom in each house. We would need at least 3 homes because at this point we had 27 children. In ways I still barely can comprehend, we finally raised enough money for a plot of land that Paul had found, and we raised the extra money needed to build the homes and furnish them. It was one miracle after another. 2017 was a year full of God's miraculous blessings. In February of 2017, we had our groundbreaking on this new piece of land. The youngest kid at the orphanage, named Maxwell, helped push that shovel into the ground with me, and we all celebrated. It was just an absolutely amazing day, and we praised God. Then finally, on November 23rd, 2017, which just happened to be Thanksgiving Day, we had our grand opening celebration. Hundreds of people came out from around the area to celebrate with us. We had a team of 25 people from the United States there to help celebrate. Nothing could have ever prepared us for what God had planned, and yet God had been preparing us for years. He gave Sarah and I the desire in our hearts to do global missions. He gave Anne the desire to rescue little children from the streets. Then he gave her the vision that he was bringing someone else to help her. God had this whole thing planned out perfectly, and we all had a front row seat to God's mysterious and beautiful ways. And really, that's how it all began.